Good morning, Elementary Literature Group. It's Mr. T. I'm coming to you live from my office in the Lanyap Cottage in Leesburg, Virginia. And we're continuing our amazing adventure story of the incredible journey. And we're going to be on chapter 4 today. I hope you enjoy it. Reminder of where we were. You remember the dramatic and really frightening attack of the bear on our three friends, and how the bears were defeated by the cat. Well, you remember that the old terrier too was really weak and sick, and then the cat killed a partridge and brought it for him to eat, and he ate it. And I'll read you the last little bit of chapter 3. An hour or two later, the purring cat joined them, carelessly dropping another succulent morsel by his old friend's nose. It was a deer mouse, a little creature with big eyes and long hind legs like a miniature kangaroo. It was swallowed with a satisfying gulp, and soon the old dog went back to sleep. But the cat purred against his chest, and the young dog curled at his back, were wakeful and alert most of the remaining night, neither one of them moving from his side. Chapter 4. Hunger was now the ruling instinct for the Labrador, and it drove him out to forage in the early dawn. He was desperate enough to try some deer droppings, that's deer poop, but spat them out immediately in disgust. While he was drinking from a marsh pool still covered with lily pads, he saw a frog staring at him with goggle eyes from a small stone. Measuring the distance carefully, he sprang and caught it in the air as it leapt for safety. It disappeared down his throat with one crunch, and he looked around happily for more. But an hour's patient search rewarded him with only 2, so he returned to his companions. They'd apparently eaten, for there were feathers and fur gathered around, and both were licking their lips. But something warned him not to urge his old companion on. The terrier was still utterly exhausted, and in addition had lost a lot of blood from the gashes suffered at the cub's claws the day before. They were stiff and black with blood, and had a tendency to open and bleed slightly with any movement. So all that day he lay peacefully in the warm fall sunshine of the grass, on the grass, sleeping, eating what the cat provided, and wagging his tail whenever one of the others came near. The young dog spent most of the day still occupied with his ceaseless foraging for food. By evening he was desperate, but his luck turned when a rabbit, already changing to its white winter coat, suddenly started up from the long grass and swerved across the path. Head down, tail flying, the young dog gave chase, swerving and turning in pursuit. But always the rabbit was just out of reach of his hungry jaws. At last he put all his strength into one violent lunge and felt the warm, pulsating prize in his mouth. The generations fell away, the years of training never to sink teeth into feathers or fur. Remember, he was trained as a retriever who would retrieve birds that were shot down by his master, and the dogs were trained as retrievers not to eat the animals that they were retrieving. So, for a moment, the Labrador looked almost wolf-like as he tore the warm flesh and bolted it down in ravenous gulps. They slept in the same place that night and most of the following day. The weather mercifully continued warm and sunny. Remember, this is the autumn, and you know what comes after autumn is winter. And we're in very northern latitudes here up in Canada. So that's something to think about. He had spent most of the day ambling around and sleeping, so that by now he seemed almost frisky and quite eager to walk a little. So in the afternoon, they left the place which had been their home for 3 days and trotted slowly along the track together again. By the time the moon rose, they had traveled several miles, and they had come to the edge of a small lake, which the track skirted by. A moose was standing in the water among the lily pads on the far shore, his great antlered head and humped neck silhouetted clearly against the pale moon. Oh man, listen to that sentence. This writer is so good at describing. Listen to this. Close your eyes and see if you can see in your mind's eye. A moose was standing in the water among the lily pads on the far shore, his great antlered head and humped neck silhouetted against the pale moon. Wow. He took no notice of the strange animals across the water, but thrust his head again and again under the water, raising it high in the air after each immersion and arching his neck. 2 or 3 water hens swam out from the reeds. A little crested gerby popped up like a jack-in-the-box in the water beside him, and the spreading ripples of their wake caught the light of the moon. As the 3 sat, ears perked, they watched. The moose squelched slowly out of the muddy water, shaking himself and turned, catering up the bank out of sight. The young dog turned his head suddenly, his nose twitching, for his keen scent had caught the distant whiff of wood smoke and something else, something unidentifiable. That's our author giving us a hint that something significant is about to happen. Seconds later, the old dog caught the scent too and started to his feet, snuffing and questioning his own nose. His thin, whippy tail began to sweep to and fro, and a bright gleam appeared in his slanted black currant eyes. Somewhere, not too far away, were human beings. His world. He could not mistake their message or refuse their invitation. They were undoubtedly cooking something. He trotted off determinedly in the direction of the tantalizing smell. The young dog followed somewhat reluctantly, and for once the cat passed them both, a little moon-mad perhaps, for he lay in wait to dart and strike, and then streak back into the shadows, only to reappear a second later in an elaborate stalk of their tails. Both of the dogs ignored him. He wanted to play. The scent of the evening breeze was a fragrant compound of roasting rice, wild duck stew, and wood smoke. Again, descriptive writing. I can smell it. When the animals looked down from a hill, tantalizing and hungry, they saw 6 or 7 fires in the clearing below, their flames lighting up a semicircle of tents and conical birch bark shelters against a dark background of trees. Flickering over the canoes drawn up on the edge of a wild rice marsh, marshes are wetlands, and dying redly in the black waters beyond, and throwing into ruddy relief the high, flat plains of brown Ojibwe faces. Ojibwe are a Native American tribe that occupied Canada, and obviously during these times they were still living in their traditional villages. They were nomads, and so they had these temporary tents set up. These brown Ojibwe faces gathered around the center of warmth and brightness. The men wore a colored lot in jeans and bright plaid shirts, but the women were dressed in somber colors. 2 young boys, the only children there, were going from fire to fire, shaking grain in shallow pans and stirring it with paddles as it parched. What they're cooking there is wild rice. How many of you guys have ever eaten wild rice? Little black rice seeds? It's really tasty. But it grows like a wild grass, and the Indians would harvest it, and they're cooking it. One man in long, soft moccasins, those are the shoes that Native Americans wear, made out of animal skin. Long, soft moccasins stood in a shallow pit, trampling husk, half of his weight supported on a log frame. Some of the band lay back from the fires, smoking and watching idly, talking softly among themselves, while others still ate, ladling the fragrant contents of a black iron pot onto tin plates. And then every now and then one of them would throw a bone back over his shoulder into the bush, and the watching animals gazed hungrily after. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing, pouring grain from one bark platter to another, and the loose chaff drifted out of on the slight wind like smoke. The old dog saw nothing of this, but his ears and nose supplied all he needed to know. He could contain himself no longer and picked his way carefully down the hillside, for his shoulder still pained him. Halfway down, he sneezed violently in an eddy of chaff. Chaff is the hulls on the rice, and the women were harvesting, grinding the rice and taking the chaff off of it. One of the boys by the fire looked up at the sound, his hand closing on a stone, but the woman nearby spoke sharply, and he waited, watching intently. The old dog limped out of the shadows and into the ring of the firelight, confident, friendly, and sure of his welcome, his tail wagging, his whole stern ingratiatingly, ears and lips laid back in his nightmarish grimace. There was a stunned silence, broken by the wail of terror from the small boy who flung himself at his mother, and then a quick, excited chatter among the Indians. The old dog was rather offended and uncertain for a moment, but he made hopefully for the nearest boy, who retreated nervously, clutching his stone. But again the woman rebuked her son, and at the sharpness of her tone, the old dog stopped, crestfallen. He just wanted to get petted by a human, huh? Hold on. Vasquez walked quickly across the ring of the firelight, stooping down to look more closely. The dog did, the terrier. She spoke some soft words of reassurance and then patted his head gently and smiled at him. The old dog leaned against her and whipped his tail against her black stockings, happy to be in the contact of humans being once again. She crouched down beside him to run her fingers lightly over his ears and back, and when he licked her face appreciatively, she laughed. At this, the two little boys drew near to the dog, and the rest of the band gathered round. Soon the old dog was where he most loved to be, the center of attention among some human beings. He made the most of it and played to an appreciative audience. When one of the men tossed him a chunk of meat, he sat up painfully on his hindquarters and begged for more, waving one paw in the air. This sent the Indians into paroxysms of laughter, and he had to repeat the performance time and time again until he was tired and lay down, panting but happy. The Indian woman stroked him gently in reward and then ladled some meat from the pot onto the grass. The old dog limped toward it, but before he ate it, he looked up in the direction of the hillside where he had left his two companions. A small stone rebounded from rock to rock, then rolled into the sudden silence that followed. When a long-legged, blue-eyed cat appeared out of the darkness, paused, and filled the clearing with a strident, plaintive voice before walking up to the dog and calmly taking a piece of meat from him, the Indians laughed until they were speechless and hiccuping. The two little boys rolled on the ground, kicking their heels in an abandonment of mirth. Mirth means happiness. While the cat chewed his meat unmoved, but this was the kind of behavior the bull terrier understood, and he joined in the fun. But he rose so enthusiastically that his wounds reopened. When he got to his feet again, his white coat was stained with blood. All this time, the young dog crouched on the hillside, motionless and watching, although every driving, urgent nerve in his body fretted and strained at the delay. He watched the cat, well-fed and contented, curl himself on the lap of one of the sleepy children by the fire. He heard the faint note of derision in some of the Indians' voices as a little bent, ancient crone addressed them in earnest and impassioned tones before hobbling over to the dog to examine his shoulder as he lay peacefully before the fire. She threw some cattail roots into a boiling pot of water, soaked some moss in the liquid, and pressed it against the dark gashes. The old dog did not move, only his tail beat slowly. When she had finished, she scooped some more meat onto a piece of birch bark and set it on the grass before the old dog. And the silent watcher above, that's the young dog, licked his lips and sat up, but still he did not move from his place. But when the fires began to burn low and the Indians made preparations for the night, and still his companions showed no signs of moving, the young dog grew restless. He skirted the camp, moving like a shadow through the trees on the hill behind, until he came out upon the lake shore a quarter mile upwind from the camp, and then he barked sharply and imperatively several times. The effect was like an alarm bell on the other two. The cat sprang from the arms of the sleepy little Indian boy and ran towards the old dog, who was already on his feet, blinking and peering around rather confusedly. The cat gave a guttural yowl and then deliberately ran ahead, looking back as he paused beyond the range of the firelight. The old dog shook himself resigningly and walked slowly after, reluctant to leave the warmth of the fire. The Indians watched him passively and silently and made no move to stop him. Only the woman who had first befriended him called out softly, in the tongue of her native people, a farewell to the traveler. The dog halted at the tree line beside the cat and looked back, but the commanding, summoning bark was heard again, and together the two passed out of sight and into the blackness of the night. That night they became immortal. Had they known or cared for the ancient woman, had recognized the old dog at once by his color and companion. He was the white dog of the Ojibwe, the virtuous white dog of Oman, whose appearance heralds either disaster or good fortune. The spirits had sent him, hungry and wounded, to test tribal hospitality, and for benevolent proof to the skeptical, they had chosen a cat as their companion. For what mortal dog would suffer a cat to rob him of his meat? He had been made welcome, fed and succored. The omen would prove fortunate. And that's the end of chapter 4. I hope you enjoyed it. Elementary literature. We'll see you again next Friday. This is Mr. T. Over and out.